Friends come and go, but Jesus comes and stays forever. That's probably one of the most profound things you'll hear all day when you think about how friends come and go over the years. But for those of you that are saved out there, you know that Jesus stays around forever. To many of us out there, Jesus is our best friend. And as Christians, we're called not only to follow Jesus, but to do it the way that Jesus and the disciples did it. We are a continuation of that ministry, a legacy of that tradition. We do it the Jesus way, not the 501c3 way. If you think about what it means to be a Christian, not only are we doing it the Jesus way, but we're doing it the Bible way. We're doing it God's way. Otherwise, we're doing it the devil's way. And, this example of choosing between God's ways and the devil's ways repeats itself in the Bible over and over again. But the primordial example begins with Adam and Eve, or I should say Eve and the snake. God said, "Don't eat the fruit on the tree, or you will die." And the devil said to Eve, the snake said to Eve, "You can eat the fruit on the tree. You won't die." That was the devil's way. Well, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they went from being immortal to mortals, kicked out of the garden and the works. And that's because they did it the devil's way. So as Christians, we're called to do it God's way. And everything else is basically the devil's way. Now, Jesus obviously was doing it God's way. And that means we should be doing it the way that Jesus and the disciples were doing it. Obviously, we know that modern churches are doing it a different way. The Sodom and Gomorrah way these days. The devil's ways. Wolves in sheep's clothing in just about most churches out there. That's the 501c3 way. That's not the way that we're called to do it. And so we need to understand the difference. That's our responsibility. Ignorance will never be an excuse. We have to do our own research. Kind of like 9/11, but this time with the Bible. And as we do our own research and we see the way that Jesus was doing it, we're reminded that Jesus was celebrating the Passover. It sounds kind of weird, but it's highly important. And the Passover is coming soon. And so we should be doing it the Jesus way, this Passover, and observing that day for what it represents. That's when the firstborn of Egypt were killed. Just like that. The faithful were passed over. Being faithful, doing it God's way, is what we're called to do. And so we need to observe Passover, and we need to observe God's ways, just like Jesus did. If Jesus could go into one of these modern churches today and see how Christians are doing it, he would probably be turning over a lot of tables. And maybe even breaking statues. There's a lot of people in Christian churches today worshiping statues of somebody that isn't Jesus. That would be idolatry. We're not called to do that. Another thing that's worth noting here is that Jesus never worshipped himself. When they asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus said to know that God is one Lord, one God. And Jesus always made the distinction between himself and God Almighty. He taught his disciples to pray the Our Father, not the Our Jesus. In John chapter 14, not only does Jesus make the distinction, but he says that God Almighty is greater than I. Jesus says that. There's no confusion. There's no polytheism. Jesus is doing it the right way. Jesus is doing it God's way. This is what we're called to do. And when you do that, then you'll be on that straight and narrow path. Otherwise, Jesus may and probably will say to you, he never knew you. Get away from him. Get away from me, ye that work iniquity. You don't want to be that person. You don't want to do it the 501c3 way. You don't want to do it the devil's way. You want to do it God's way. So do your own research and be sure to celebrate the Passover properly, just like Jesus did. Till the next time, if you're listening to this, you are the resistance.